July 1st, 1942. Pearl Harbor. Under guard, Japanese prisoners from the carrier Hiryu are brought into the harbor their Navy had helped make famous 7 months earlier. What they see is not the image Tokyo had sold to itself in the winter of 1941. It is not a silent anchorage of twisted wreckage, not a dead fleet base left crippled by one perfect blow, not the shattered monument to Japanese surprise that men across the Pacific had imagined after the attack of December 7th. Instead, there is movement everywhere. Cranes hang over the water like steel skeletons. Repair crews move across decks and scaffolds. Harbor craft cut through the channel. Smoke rises from workshops, not from destruction now, but from labor. Dry docks are busy. Piers are alive. The base is scarred, but it is functioning. More than that, it is preparing for war. For prisoners arriving from the catastrophe of Midway, the contradiction would have been impossible to miss. This was Pearl Harbor, and Pearl Harbor was supposed to be broken. That is the mystery at the heart of this story. How did the harbor Japan struck with such violence in December become, by the summer of 1942, an active forward war base again? How had the place that looked ruined in every newspaper photograph become one of the engines of America's return? The first revelation is that the prisoners really did arrive here. That part is not legend. Japanese survivors captured in the widening Pacific War were transported into Hawaii, into the very harbor their country had attacked. The second revelation is more important and more unsettling for the men who planned Pearl Harbor. By the time those prisoners entered the base, Pearl Harbor was not simply surviving. It was already proving that the attack had failed in the most dangerous way possible, because ships had been sunk, men had burned, Battleship Row had become a landscape of smoke, oil, and steel. But the harbor itself had not died, and what Japan had missed on the day of triumph would become clearer with each passing month. To understand how this happened, we have to go back to the morning when the world believed Pearl Harbor had been destroyed. December 7th, 1941, Oahu, Hawaii, just before 8 in the morning. The harbor wakes slowly that Sunday. Sailors are dressing, eating, smoking, writing letters. Along Battleship Row, the great hulls lie still beside Ford Island, gray and heavy in the early light. It is supposed to be another routine morning in the Pacific Fleet, a quiet one. Then engines are heard overhead. At first, some men do not understand what they are hearing. Aircraft are not unusual, but these planes are too low, too fast, too aggressive. Then the first bombs fall, and the illusion of routine vanishes in an instant. Japanese carrier aircraft sweep over Pearl Harbor in coordinated waves. Torpedo bombers race toward the battleships. Dive bombers plunge through smoke and tracer fire. Fighters slash at airfields to pin American aircraft to the ground before they can get airborne. In minutes, the harbor becomes an industrial inferno. The USS Oklahoma rolls after taking torpedo hits. The USS West Virginia begins to sink. The USS California settles lower in the water. On the USS Arizona, a bomb detonates the forward magazine, and the explosion rips the ship apart with such force that men across the harbor feel the blast in their chests. Oil spreads across the water. Steel screams. Men leap from burning decks into black slicks that are already catching fire. Others are trapped below in darkness, cut off by flooding compartments, jammed hatches, and shattered power lines. Commands are shouted through smoke. Anti-aircraft guns open late, then louder, then everywhere. The harbor that had seemed at rest only minutes before now looks as though it is being torn open from the inside. And this is where the illusion begins, because the devastation is real. That cannot be softened. The attack is a tactical triumph. It shocks the United States, stuns the world, and creates an image so powerful that it will dominate public memory for generations. Pearl Harbor in flames, the Pacific Fleet smashed, America caught helpless. But even inside the chaos, another truth is hiding beneath the smoke. The Japanese have hit ships and aircraft. They have not destroyed the full machinery that makes Pearl Harbor valuable. The fuel storage facilities survive. The great repair yards survive. The dry docks survive. The submarine base survives. The visible strength of the fleet has been mauled, but the hidden organs of recovery are still alive. No one standing in the firelight can see the full meaning of that yet. Not the sailors dragging wounded men across hot steel. Not the officers trying to restore command through shattered communications. not the pilots turning away from Oahu believing they have delivered a decisive, war-changing blow. But out beyond the smoke, beyond the burning silhouettes on Battleship Row, the future is already taking shape. And it will begin not with revenge speeches or victory parades, but with divers, welders, pumps, and men determined to raise the dead. The fire does not end when the planes leave. That is the first thing to understand about Pearl Harbor. The attack itself is measured in minutes. The consequences stretch through the day, through the night, and then deep into the weeks that follow. When the second wave of Japanese aircraft pulls away from Oahu late that morning, the harbor is still burning, still flooding, still killing men trapped inside compartments that have become sealed ovens of smoke and steam. The image that survives in history is often frozen. Battleships aflame, black smoke towering into the Hawaiian sky, men scrambling across oil-slick water. But from the ground, from the decks, from the lower compartments and hospital wards and shattered airfields, this is not a single image. It is an unfolding disaster. On Ford Island and along Battleship Row, crews fight to save ships that are already slipping away from them. Damage control parties improvise with what they have, sometimes with hoses that have lost pressure, sometimes with pumps that cannot keep pace with the water pouring through torn hulls. Men carry ammunition by hand. Others drag the burned and the bleeding toward whatever cover, aid station, or launch they can find. On the capsized USS Oklahoma, tapping can be heard from within the hull. Trapped sailors are still alive inside the overturned ship, and rescue efforts begin almost immediately, even as the danger of fire and further collapse remains. On the Arizona, there is almost nothing to save. The blast has been too violent, the destruction too immediate. The ship has become a tomb in seconds. Across Oahu, the attack has also hit airfields with brutal precision. At Hickam, Wheeler, Bellows, and other installations, aircraft that might have risen to challenge the attackers are caught lined up wingtip to wingtip, vulnerable to strafing and bombs. Men who had expected a Sunday routine find themselves firing from the ground, loading weapons under attack, or crawling through wreckage on runways littered with burning planes. And so a perception begins to harden, not just in Pearl Harbor but across the world. Japan has not merely struck the United States. Japan has humiliated it. That matters because wars are shaped not only by destruction, but by interpretation. On December 7th, the interpretation seems obvious. The Pacific Fleet has been crippled. American battleships have been sunk or heavily damaged. The Great Fleet Base in Hawaii appears broken open. The attack looks so complete, so dramatic, so visually overwhelming that it invites one dangerous conclusion: that Pearl Harbor has been removed from the war as a functioning instrument of American power. That is the first reveal of this section. The visual devastation is so overwhelming that it temporarily hides what has actually survived. The second reveal comes not from triumph, but from omission, because the Japanese attack, for all its discipline and skill, has left critical parts of the base intact. The machine shops are still there. The dry docks still stand. The fuel storage system has not been destroyed. The submarine facilities are untouched. The naval yard still exists. The harbor has been mauled in the visible places, but the support structure that makes a fleet base capable of recovery has not been annihilated. At the time, this distinction is not yet emotionally legible. To the men standing in smoke and wreckage, the difference between tactical damage and strategic paralysis is too abstract, too distant. What they know is pain, confusion, and loss. They know friends are dead. They know ships are settling in the mud. They know the Pacific War has begun in the worst possible way. And yet, even on this day that looks final, the machinery of response begins to turn. Telephone lines jam, then reconnect. Reports move upward through commanders who are struggling to understand whether more attacks are coming. Harbor authorities start assessing channels, berths, and damaged infrastructure. Medical units begin triage on a scale they had not imagined, and somewhere beneath the emotional thunder of the day, practical minds are already asking the questions that matter next. Which ships can be saved? Which channels remain usable? Which facilities are intact? How quickly can fuel, repair, and command functions be stabilized? This is not cinematic in the usual sense. It is not the language of hero posters or revenge slogans. It is the language of systems under shock, But that is precisely why it matters, because what answers Pearl Harbor first is not speech, it is organization. The public response, of course, arrives quickly. On December 8th, Franklin Roosevelt goes before Congress and delivers the words that will define the national meaning of the attack. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The phrase becomes permanent almost at once, fixing the event in American memory as both trauma and turning point. And later in that same address comes another line that matters just as much, the promise that the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory. But in Hawaii, victory still feels very far away. There is no clean arc yet, no certainty, no visible comeback. Only smoke, only wreckage, only the knowledge that the war has begun with a stunning Japanese success. For Japanese planners, that apparent success confirms the logic of the strike. The Pacific Fleet seems crippled. The path to Japan's southern offensives appears wider. And that is exactly where the trap begins. Because while commanders in Tokyo assess the attack through the lens of sunken ships and burning decks, the Americans in Pearl Harbor are beginning, hour by hour, to discover something else. The base is wounded, but not dead. And if the base is still alive, then the fleet in some form can rise again. The next chapter of this story will not begin with a battleship. It will begin on a Hawaiian shoreline with a soaked, exhausted Japanese officer who becomes something no one had expected so soon after the attack, the first prisoner of the Pacific War. The day after Pearl Harbor, the war is already changing shape. The harbor is still smoking. Rescue work is still underway. Men are still being counted, identified, and in many cases not found at all. The attack has torn open the Pacific Fleet, and across Oahu the island is tense with expectation. Rumors move faster than facts. There is fear of invasion, fear of saboteurs, fear that what happened on the morning of December 7th was only the beginning. And on the eastern side of the island, along the shoreline near Waimanalo and the Bellows area, another thread of the story is about to surface from the sea. It begins not with a carrier pilot or a battleship commander, but with one of the smallest weapons used in the attack, a Japanese midget submarine. While the carrier aircraft had delivered the visible blow at Pearl Harbor, Japan had also sent midget submarines into Hawaiian waters as part of the operation. Their mission was risky, secretive, and desperate from the start. These tiny craft were supposed to slip into the harbor chaos and add another layer of destruction. Instead, most were lost, sunk, or failed before they could change the battle. One of them was HA-19. Its commander was Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki. By the time he reaches shore, he is no triumphant raider. He is exhausted, disoriented, battered by surf, and cut off from the entire strategy he had sailed into. His submarine has failed. The mission has failed. The massive surprise attack that began as a symbol of Japanese initiative has, for him, ended in isolation and capture. This is the first reveal of the section. The first Japanese prisoner of war taken by the United States in the Pacific is captured not months later in some distant island campaign, but on Oahu itself, the day after Pearl Harbor. That fact matters far beyond biography. It links the POW story directly back to the attack from the very beginning. The enemy did not merely strike Pearl Harbor and vanish into legend. One of its men was left behind by the operation almost immediately, and his capture became an early sign that even the most carefully designed assault could leave loose ends, broken edges, and human wreckage. Sakamaki is found and taken into custody by American personnel on the island, including Hawaii National Guard Master Sergeant David Akui. In later retellings, a short phrase is often associated with Sakamaki at the moment of capture. It is usually rendered as a simple admission of physical misery rather than drama. Whether remembered exactly or polished by retelling, the image survives because it is so small compared to the scale of the attack. A man sent into history's most famous surprise strike is reduced within hours to cold, fatigue, and defeat. That is the second reveal. Because in Japanese planning, Pearl Harbor had been designed as a demonstration of precision and control. But here, at the edge of Oahu, the war is already showing another face: confusion, failure, survival by chance, and the collapse of carefully arranged myths. Sakamaki had not become a martyr, he had become a prisoner. And in the culture of Imperial Japan, that carried its own humiliation. Capture was not simply military defeat, It was shame. For the Americans, though, Sakamaki's capture means something different. It is evidence. Evidence that the attackers were not invulnerable. Evidence that the Japanese assault included more than aircraft. Evidence that the battle around Hawaii is not only one of destruction, but of intelligence, interrogation, and recovered fragments. You can almost feel the shift beginning here. On December 7th, Americans had experienced Pearl Harbor as pure shock. On December 8th, they begin to study it. They examine wreckage. They trace attack methods. They identify types of aircraft, torpedoes, submarines. They move from being stunned recipients of violence to analysts of what was done to them. That is a quieter transformation than vengeance, but in military terms, it is just as important. The United States is not only grieving now, it is learning, and Pearl Harbor itself is changing in the same way. Back in the harbor, the visible work is still grim. Fires are being extinguished. Dead are being recovered. Ships lie half submerged or rolled over in the water. But beneath the mourning, officials and engineers are already beginning to organize the base's response in more systematic terms. What can be patched? What can be pumped out? What can be righted, sealed, cut open, or moved? Which berths are blocked? Which dry docks are available? Which teams can dive? Which workshops can operate? The phrase, "we keep them fit to fight," will come to symbolize the Pearl Harbor yard at war. But before it becomes a motto, it begins as a necessity. Because if Sakamaki's capture reveals that the attackers were not flawless, the harbor itself is about to reveal something even more consequential. The defenders were not finished. The Japanese had hit ships. That much was undeniable. They had burned steel, killed sailors, and created one of the great visual shocks of the war. But they had not fully understood the base beneath the fleet, the hidden structure of docks, labor, fuel, and repair capacity that made recovery possible. And once that reality comes into focus, the meaning of Pearl Harbor begins to shift. Not from tragedy to triumph. Not yet. But from ending to contest. The next discovery will happen not on a beach, but on the map of the harbor itself, where the most important targets of all were the ones Japan left standing. In war, what you destroy matters. But what you fail to destroy can matter even more. That is the hidden truth inside Pearl Harbor. On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese strike force achieved something extraordinary in tactical terms. It crossed the Pacific in secrecy, struck with precision, and delivered a blow so visually overwhelming that much of the world believed the American Pacific Fleet had been knocked out of the war in a single morning. And if you judged the attack only by the photographs of that day, it was easy to believe. Battleships burned along Ford Island. Aircraft were wrecked on the ground. Smoke swallowed the harbor. The symbols of American naval power looked broken, humiliated, and still. But symbols are not systems. As U.S. commanders and engineers began to examine the damage more closely, the map of Pearl Harbor revealed something the Japanese attack had not fully erased. The great fuel storage system remained intact. The naval shipyard still stood. Dry Dock Number 1 and Dry Dock Number 2 had survived. The submarine base was still there. Machine shops, repair facilities, and the industrial organs of the harbor, the less glamorous structures that actually allowed a fleet to live, recover, and fight, had not been destroyed. This is the first major reframing of the story. Japan had crippled visible combat power. It had not killed recovery capacity. That distinction may sound technical, almost bloodless, compared to the horror of the attack itself, but in strategic terms, it was everything. A fleet base is not only its ships. It is fuel. It is dock space. It is cranes, pumps, welders, machine tools, divers, electricians, storehouses, command networks, and repair schedules. It is the ability to bring damaged hulls back into service, to refuel ships returning from sea, to patch, rearm, sortie, and sustain. Pearl Harbor still had those things. And that is the first reveal of this section. The real center of gravity at Pearl Harbor was not only what was floating in the harbor on the morning of December 7th, it was the support system beneath it. Japan had smashed the face of the base, but not its spine. For Japanese planners, the logic of the attack had been clear. Strike hard enough, fast enough, and the United States would lose precious months in the Pacific. Japan could then consolidate its conquests to the south, secure oil and raw materials, and build a defensive perimeter so vast and costly that America might hesitate to break it. The attack was not supposed to conquer Hawaii. It was supposed to buy time, and in one sense, it worked. Pearl Harbor was a tactical success of enormous power. Battleships were sunk or crippled. The United States was shocked. The Pacific balance seemed to tilt. But the strike had been shaped by what was most visible: ships in harbor, aircraft on airfields, spectacular destruction. It did not fully solve the slower, less cinematic question of how to keep America from repairing itself. That is the second reveal, because wars are rarely decided by the violence of a single morning. They are decided by what remains possible after the violence ends. In Hawaii, this truth becomes clearer with each passing day. Officers survey channels and berths. Yard workers begin planning around what survived. Salvage specialists study flooded compartments and twisted hulls, not as monuments to defeat, but as technical problems waiting to be solved. The battleships lying in the mud are not yet dead in every sense. Some can be refloated. Some can be stripped for parts, weapons, and lessons. Some can return in one form or another. Even the wrecks still hold value. And because the dry docks and repair infrastructure remain intact, Pearl Harbor is not reduced to a graveyard. It remains, however painfully, a working naval base. This changes the meaning of the entire attack, not in the public imagination immediately. Publicly, Pearl Harbor remains the image of devastation. That image is too strong, too recent, too emotionally true to be displaced overnight. Roosevelt's date, which will live in infamy, speech frames the national response in moral and political terms, and rightly so. The attack is a trauma. It demands vengeance, unity, and war. But inside the base, men are dealing with a more practical question. Can this harbor still function? The answer, slowly and against appearances, is yes. Not perfectly, not without immense labor, not without months of danger, exhaustion, and technical improvisation. But yes, fuel can still support operations. Docks can still receive damaged ships. Repair crews can still work. Submarines can still sortie. The harbor can still contribute to war. It is not the shattered relic Japanese planners hoped it would become. And once that fact is understood, everything else begins to change. Because now the mission is no longer simply to mourn what was lost. It is to exploit what survived. That is where Admiral Chester W. Nimitz will soon enter the story, arriving in Hawaii on Christmas Day to assume command of a fleet that looks broken from the outside, but is already beginning, underneath the scars, to reorganize around endurance. And it is where men like Captain Homer N. Wallen and the salvage teams will become some of the most important figures in the Pacific, though few outside the Navy will know their names. The next stage of Pearl Harbor's answer will not come from speeches or ceremonies. It will come from pumps dropped into flooded hulls, divers descending through black water, and crews working beside wreckage that the world still believes is finished. Pearl Harbor did not recover through symbolism. It recovered through labor. That is the part of the story that rarely appears first in public memory. People remember the flames on Battleship Row. They remember the Arizona exploding into a pillar of fire. They remember Roosevelt's voice and the language of infamy. But what came next was not theatrical. It was technical, dirty, dangerous, and relentless. It was a war fought with pumps, cables, cofferdams, torches, compressors, patch plates, diving suits, and men willing to go down into black water under broken ships. Almost immediately after the attack, the Navy began organizing what would become one of the most remarkable salvage efforts of the war. Captain Homer N. Wallen emerged as one of the central figures in that work, helping direct the massive effort to assess, stabilize, refloat, strip, and recover the damaged fleet. His war would not be fought on a bridge or in a cockpit. It would be fought in flooded compartments where the air was foul, visibility was near zero, and every step could bring a man against jagged metal, loose wires, trapped fuel, or bodies not yet recovered. The harbor itself had become a kind of industrial battlefield. You can imagine the smell before anything else: fuel oil spread across the water, smoke still lingering over the moorings, wet steel, burned insulation, mud from the harbor bottom, and the stale bottom, heavy air trapped inside submerged spaces. Divers descended into ships that had rolled, settled, or flooded unevenly. Compartments that had once been orderly now had ceilings where walls should be and walls where decks should be. Nothing was where it belonged. Tools, ammunition, cables, bodies, papers, lockers, fragments of machinery, all of it had shifted into lethal confusion. And yet the work begins with a decision more important than any single tool. The Navy is not treating the sunken ships merely as wrecks. It is treating them as assets. That is the first reveal of this section. Pearl Harbor's damaged battleships are not being left in place as monuments to the attack. They are being examined, categorized, and where possible, prepared for return. Some will sail again. Some will yield guns, parts, and equipment useful elsewhere. Even where total restoration is not possible on site, salvage itself becomes a form of power. The harbor is already converting destruction into future combat value. This changes the emotional meaning of the wreckage. A sunken ship is still a tragedy. It is still a tomb in some cases. But in the logic of Pearl Harbor's salvage effort, it is also a problem to be solved. Hulls are patched. Water is pumped out. Openings are sealed. Cranes move. Welders work. Teams strip away ruined material to make access possible. Cofferdams are fitted to damaged sections so compartments can be emptied without the sea rushing back in. It is not elegant work. It is exhausting, repetitive, and often terrifying. But each hour of it pushes back against the visual verdict of December 7th, because the harbor is doing something the Japanese planners never intended it to do. It is learning how to rise from inside the damage. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz's arrival in Hawaii on December 25, 1941, gives this transformation a sharper strategic frame. He inherits a Pacific Fleet that still carries the shock of the attack, but he also inherits a base whose core support structure survived. That matters. A commander can only counterattack from what still exists. Nimitz does not step into a dead anchorage. He steps into a wounded but functioning war base, scarred, grieving, overstretched, but alive enough to matter. And under him, the salvage effort is not peripheral. It is central. The phrase later associated with the Pearl Harbor Yard, "We keep them fit to fight," captures the spirit of what is happening. Not revenge in slogan form, but endurance turned into process. The answer to Pearl Harbor is becoming mechanical, procedural, almost stubborn in its discipline. Men work in shifts, plans are revised, damage estimates change, improvisation becomes routine. The harbor refuses to remain a snapshot of defeat. That is the second reveal. The American response to Pearl Harbor is not first expressed in speeches, but in restored capability, before the great offensives, before the island campaigns, before the full industrial avalanche of American war production becomes visible across the globe. Pearl Harbor is already rehearsing the deeper truth of the war. The United States is at its most dangerous when it can absorb punishment and keep building. And this is what makes the salvage crews so important. They are not merely cleaning up after disaster. They are proving that disaster has limits. Ship by ship, compartment by compartment, the evidence begins to accumulate. Channels can be cleared. Hulls can be stabilized. Machinery can be recovered. Fuel can still move. Docks can still receive damaged vessels. The base that looked shattered on December 7th is, under the surface, beginning to function with grim purpose. But the world outside Hawaii cannot yet see the full scale of that change. To most observers, Pearl Harbor is still the place of burning battleships. The image of defeat remains stronger than the reality of recovery. That is why the next milestones will matter so much. Because once ships begin to rise, not in theory, but in fact, the myth of permanent paralysis will start to crack. And the first proof will come in steel. A battleship that should have remained a symbol of disaster is about to come back above the waterline. At first, recovery at Pearl Harbor could still be dismissed as effort without proof. Men could work around the clock. Divers could descend into flooded compartments. Engineers could draft plans over stained tables and issue calm, technical orders into a harbor that still smelled of fuel and death. But until something visible changed, until the wreckage itself began to move, the attack still seemed to belong to Japan. That is what makes the next phase so important. Pearl Harbor's answer is about to become measurable. Not in speeches, not in intentions, in ships. The first great sign comes with USS Nevada. On the morning of December 7th, Nevada had become one of the most dramatic images of the attack. She had tried to get underway while bombs and torpedoes were tearing through the harbor around her, making her the only battleship to move during the assault. For a moment, That movement had looked almost heroic, a wounded ship trying to claw its way into open water under fire. But the damage was too severe. To keep her from sinking in the channel and blocking the harbor entirely, she had to be beached. That might have been where the story ended in another navy, in another war. But at Pearl Harbor, a beached battleship was not the end of the sentence. On February 12, 1942, Nevada was refloated. That is the first reveal of this section. Barely 2 months after the attack, one of the most damaged symbols of Pearl Harbor's humiliation is back above the water in usable form, soon entering dry dock number 2. This is no longer a promise of recovery. It is recovery made visible. And once that happens, something shifts in the psychological balance of the story. Because ships carry emotional weight. A repaired workshop is important. A functioning dry dock is important. But a refloated battleship is undeniable. It tells sailors, commanders, workers, and perhaps most importantly the enemy, that the harbor is not preserving ruins. It is reversing them. Then comes California. Unlike the instant catastrophe of Arizona, California's fate had been slower, heavier, more lingering. She had taken torpedo and bomb damage, and her crew had fought to save her, even as flooding worsened and the ship settled into the mud. For months, she remained part of the wounded landscape of the harbor, a huge steel body sitting low in the water, as if the attack were still physically pressing down on her. But salvage at Pearl Harbor is not symbolic theater. It is systematic. One success does not stand alone for long. On March 24, 1942, California is refloated. By April 9th, she enters dry dock number 2. Now the pattern is impossible to ignore. Nevada was not an isolated feat. California proves that the harbor's recovery is organized, repeatable, and cumulative. Pearl Harbor is no longer rescuing a single ship from the memory of disaster. It is rebuilding capacity through sequence and method. The mud, oil, and wreckage of December are being converted into engineering problems with deadlines. This is the second reveal. Recovery at Pearl Harbor is not emotional improvisation. It is industrial rhythm. That distinction matters enormously, because a one-time rescue can be dismissed as luck, determination, even propaganda. But repeated salvage milestones suggest something more dangerous to Japan, an underlying system, a system that can absorb loss, organize labor, and steadily restore usefulness where the enemy expected paralysis. And then comes West Virginia. Of all the great wrecked silhouettes left in the harbor after the attack, West Virginia had been among the most dramatic. Hammered by multiple torpedoes and bombs, she had sunk at her moorings in a state that looked final to the outside eye. Her superstructure still rose above the water, but the ship itself seemed pinned in place, part of the harbor floor now, part of the permanent aftermath. Yet salvage crews kept working. Pumps, patches, diving operations, structural stabilization, endless technical decisions. Slowly, invisibly, they prepared another resurrection. On May 17, 1942, West Virginia was floated. By June 9th, she entered dry dock number 1. 3 major ships. February, March, May. Week by week, month by month, the visual verdict of December 7th is being rewritten. You can imagine what this meant inside the harbor. Men who had seen those ships burning, listing, sinking, now watched them being raised, moved, entered into dock, and folded back into the long grammar of naval war. Not instantly restored, not magically healed. Their full return would take far longer, and in some cases later work on the mainland would be necessary. But that is not the point. The point is that Pearl Harbor is proving it can manufacture return. It can take a fleet base that looked mortally wounded and begin turning it step by step into a forward war machine again. And while Japan still measures success through the flames of the attack, the Americans are measuring something else entirely. Elapsed repair time, available dock space, restored buoyancy, repaired machinery, returned usefulness. This is what strategic resilience looks like when it stops being theory. By late spring 1942, the harbor is no longer merely recovering from Pearl Harbor. It is preparing to influence the next battle. And soon, in one of the most extraordinary feats of wartime repair, Pearl Harbor will show that it can do more than raise the fallen. It can send a carrier back into combat in time to change history. By late May 1942, Pearl Harbor had already disproved the idea that it was a dead base. Battleships had been refloated. Dry docks were busy. Salvage crews were no longer fighting only for order in the wreckage. They were restoring function. But a harder question still remained. Could Pearl Harbor do more than recover from the last battle? Could it shape the next one? That question arrived in steel and urgency on May 27th when USS Yorktown came back to Pearl Harbor after the Battle of the Coral Sea. She was one of the fleet carriers America could least afford to lose, and she was damaged badly enough that initial assessments suggested she might need months of repair. Her flight deck and supporting structure had taken punishment. Internal systems were affected. She was, by ordinary peacetime logic, not ready for immediate return to major combat. But peacetime logic was over, because while Yorktown was limping toward Hawaii, American commanders were already confronting intelligence that pointed toward another Japanese operation, one that would soon center on Midway. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz did not have the luxury of waiting for ideal repairs, ideal timing, or ideal conditions. He needed carriers. He needed them now. And that meant Pearl Harbor's shipyard was about to be asked to do something that bordered on the unbelievable. When Yorktown reached Pearl Harbor on May 27th, repair officers and shipyard specialists began what amounted to a wartime triage of a capital ship. Detailed inspections confirmed serious damage. Under normal assumptions, the work required would have kept her out of action far longer than a few days. But these were not normal assumptions, and this was not a normal harbor anymore. This was Pearl Harbor after December 7th, a place where men had been forced to learn that recovery was not a theory, it was a race. So the shipyard compressed time. Workers swarmed over Yorktown in shifts that blurred day into night. Welders threw sparks across damaged steel. Repair parties patched what absolutely had to be patched, reinforced what absolutely had to be reinforced, restored critical systems, and ignored everything that could wait. This was not a cosmetic overhaul. It was a concentrated act of operational necessity. The goal was brutally simple: make her fit to fight, and then Pearl Harbor did exactly that. In roughly 72 hours, Yorktown was repaired enough to sortie. That is the first reveal of this section. Pearl Harbor was not merely salvaging symbols of past damage. It was restoring a frontline aircraft carrier quickly enough to send her into one of the most important naval battles of the war. The scale of that achievement is easy to miss if you say it too quickly. 72 hours can sound like a slogan, but in the reality of naval warfare, it was a statement of astonishing industrial compression. A damaged fleet carrier, inspected, prioritized, patched, stabilized, and made battle-worthy under emergency conditions, not in some distant secure mainland yard, but in the very harbor Japan had tried to cripple less than 6 months earlier. This is where the meaning of Pearl Harbor begins to widen, because now the harbor is doing more than proving it can survive an attack. It is proving it can absorb a blow, recover, and then project force forward fast enough to disrupt Japanese plans. The base that had seemed broken in December is now participating directly in the battle for strategic initiative. Yorktown sails. Days later at Midway, she helps form the American striking force that will meet the Japanese carrier fleet. She will be hit again there and ultimately lost, but that does not diminish what Pearl Harbor accomplished. In fact, it sharpens it. Without the emergency repair effort in late May, the U.S. carrier balance at Midway would have been even thinner at the very moment it could least afford weakness. That is the second reveal. Pearl Harbor did not just recover from Pearl Harbor. It helped make Midway possible. The attack that was supposed to buy Japan time had failed to destroy the machinery that now helped deny Japan its next great victory. And that is a devastating irony. Somewhere inside the logic of Japanese strategy had been a fatal misunderstanding. The planners had measured success in wrecked ships and burning decks. They had not fully measured the enemy's ability to restore, improvise, and return to combat before the smoke of the original victory had even fully cleared from memory. At Midway, that misunderstanding would carry catastrophic consequences for Japan. Carrier decks there would burn just as American ships had burned at Pearl Harbor. The momentum that seemed so powerful in December would begin to fracture. And from the wreckage of that battle would come another thread that pulls this story back toward Hawaii. Because after Midway, Japanese survivors would begin the journey into captivity. Some came from the heavy cruiser Mikuma. Others came from the carrier Hiryu. They were rescued, guarded, transferred, photographed, and eventually moved east toward Pearl Harbor itself. And when they arrived, they were not entering the graveyard Japan had imagined months earlier. They were entering the harbor whose labor had already helped turn the war against them. The road back to Pearl Harbor did not begin with victory. It began with defeat, fire, and men pulled from the sea. In early June 1942, the balance of the Pacific War shifted violently at Midway. There, 4 Japanese carriers were lost, among them Hiryu, one of the fleet carriers that had helped strike Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. The battle shattered more than ships. It shattered momentum. For the first time, the expanding arc of Japanese naval confidence was forced into reverse. And in the aftermath, amid burned decks, oil-dark water, and scattered survivors, another quiet transformation began. Japanese sailors became prisoners. This is where the two halves of the story finally meet. Until now, the Pearl Harbor recovery narrative and the Japanese POW narrative have moved on parallel tracks. One followed wrecked ships, salvage crews, and dry docks in Hawaii. The other followed the men. Japan lost in operations that were supposed to secure its advantage. After Midway, those tracks converge. The same war that began for Japan in triumph at Pearl Harbor is now sending Japanese captives back into the harbor that attack failed to kill. Some of the earliest post-Midway prisoners connected to this story came from the heavy cruiser Mikuma. Damaged and destroyed during the battle, Mikuma left behind survivors who would be picked up and transported east. On June 14, 1942, 2 of those Japanese survivors arrived at Pearl Harbor aboard USS Trout. That is the first reveal of this section. Japanese POWs were not a symbolic possibility in the Pearl Harbor story. They were physically entering the harbor by mid-June 1942. The significance of that is not theatrical, it is structural. The attack on Pearl Harbor had been designed to cripple a forward American base. But now that same base was active enough to receive prisoners, process traffic, sustain repairs, and continue functioning as a node in a growing American war system. By the time these captives arrived, Pearl Harbor was not simply cleaning up the past. It was helping manage the consequences of the next battle. And then came the Hiryu survivors. After Midway, some of the men rescued from the wreckage of Hiryu were taken into American custody. Official photographs from the atoll show Japanese prisoners seated under guard, a scene that feels worlds away from the violent speed of carrier warfare. There is no glamour left in those images, no aura of invincibility, only fatigue, captivity, and the strange stillness that follows sudden defeat. These prisoners did not remain at Midway. On June 23rd, they were transferred from the atoll toward Hawaii aboard USS Sirius. Days later, on July 1st, they arrived at Pearl Harbor. And that is the second reveal. By the time Japanese prisoners from one of the Pearl Harbor strike carriers entered the harbor, Pearl Harbor had already resumed its role as an active forward war base. That does not mean every dry dock was full, every wreck repaired, or every scar erased. It was not a miracle city restored overnight. Full reconstruction and modernization would take much longer. Some ships would require extensive additional work on the mainland. The memory of December 7th was still embedded in the harbor, in the missing men, in the damaged hulls, in the routines of watchfulness and war. But function had returned. That is what matters. The channel was in use. Repair facilities were active. Harbor traffic continued. The shipyard was working. The base had already helped send Yorktown back into battle before Midway. Now it was receiving the human aftermath of Japan's defeat there. And that is where the emotional power of the title lives. Not in a documented line of astonishment, not in some verified quote from a prisoner staring at the harbor, but in the contradiction itself. What would it mean for a Japanese sailor captured out of Midway to enter Pearl Harbor in July 1942? It would mean entering not a dead anchorage, but a working machine. Not a monument to Japanese success, but evidence of its limitation. Not the final image of December 7th, but the harder, more dangerous reality that followed it. You do not need invented dialogue to feel the weight of that. The facts themselves are enough. Some of these prisoners had served in the fleet that carried Japan's war outward across the Pacific. Some were now moving under guard through the same imperial geography in reverse. From the carrier battle meant to restore Japanese initiative, they were carried back to the American harbor that was supposed to have remained crippled. And there, all around them, was the proof that the war was no longer moving in one direction. This is where Pearl Harbor ceases to be only a story of attack and recovery. It becomes a story of reversal. Because by the summer of 1942, Japanese captives were not just arriving at an American base, they were arriving at a contradiction. The harbor their navy had helped devastate was still in the war. Worse than that, from Japan's perspective, it had become useful again fast enough to matter. In the next section, that contradiction will sharpen into its most dangerous form of all. Not what the prisoners may have felt, but what their arrival revealed about the war Japan thought it was winning. By the summer of 1942, the meaning of Pearl Harbor had split into two different realities. One was the reality of memory. In that reality, December 7th still stood as Japan's great opening stroke in the Pacific. The photographs of burning battleships had done their work. They had frozen the event into a permanent symbol of American vulnerability. Even months later, that image still carried force. A viewer could look at the ruins of Battleship Row and believe that Japan had achieved exactly what it intended, a decisive crippling of American power in the Pacific. But the other reality was harder to photograph. It was the reality of systems. It was measured in dry docks still functioning, fuel still available, submarines still operating, salvage schedules advancing, battleships refloated, and a carrier returned to combat in time for Midway. It was measured in the fact that prisoners from Mikuma and Hiryu were not being brought into a harbor frozen in defeat, but into one already working, repairing, receiving, and preparing. That is where the enemy perspective becomes most revealing, because the deeper failure of the Pearl Harbor attack was not that it had missed everything. It had not. The attack was devastating, tactically brilliant, and psychologically shattering. It sank or crippled battleships, destroyed aircraft, killed more than 2,000 Americans, and seized the initiative in a way few operations in modern military history ever had. But tactical brilliance is not the same as strategic completion. That is the first reveal of this section. Japan had won the image of victory. It had not secured the condition of victory. Those are two different things. If you stand inside the logic of Japanese planning in late 1941, the distinction becomes painfully clear. The purpose of Pearl Harbor was not conquest for its own sake. It was delay. Buy enough time, through a crushing blow, to secure the empire's southern resource zone and force the United States to fight from a position of shock and distance. That strategy depended on one underlying assumption, that destroying visible fleet strength would also buy lasting operational freedom. But Pearl Harbor exposed the weakness of that assumption, because visible fleet strength can be sunk faster than a naval system can be killed. Ships can burn in a morning. Repair capacity does not vanish so easily. Fuel does not disappear if it is not hit. Docks do not become irrelevant if they still stand. Trained labor, command continuity, industrial discipline, and logistical depth do not make for dramatic newsreel images, but they decide whether a fleet base stays dead or returns to work. Pearl Harbor returned to work. And from the defeated side, that should have been the most alarming truth of all. Not simply that America was angry. Anger is expected in war. Not simply that America would retaliate. Retaliation is predictable, but that America had already begun converting shock into restored function before Japan had fully consolidated the gains of its opening offensive. That is the second reveal. Japan did not just underestimate American strength in a general sense. It underestimated the speed at which American strength could reorganize itself after disaster. That is a far more dangerous mistake, because once an enemy proves it can recover faster than expected, every timetable begins to collapse. The window you thought you had begins to close. The battles you plan to fight under favorable conditions start arriving earlier. The perimeter you hope to build starts facing pressure before it is ready. The strategy that depended on time begins running out of it. And that is exactly what the summer of 1942 begins to show. Midway has already shattered Japanese carrier strength. Pearl Harbor has already shown it can repair, salvage, and sustain. The prisoners now entering Hawaii are themselves fragments of a larger reversal, They are living evidence that the war begun in triumph at Pearl Harbor is already turning into something more unstable, more punishing, and less controllable for Japan than its planners intended. You can feel the irony tightening. The harbor that was supposed to be a warning to the United States has become a warning to Japan. Not because every ship has been restored, not because the damage of December has been erased. It has not. The dead remain dead. The scars remain real. The wreckage of the attack will shape American memory forever. But strategically, Pearl Harbor is no longer speaking the language of defeat. It is speaking the language of recovery. And that language carries a terrible message for any enemy who thought a single stroke could break the United States. It says that destruction alone is not enough. It says that surprise alone is not enough. It says that even a spectacular victory can begin to rot if it fails to destroy the enemy's capacity to respond. By July 1942, Japanese prisoners entering Pearl Harbor were moving through the physical evidence of that failure. Not an imagined shock line, not a cinematic exaggeration, a harder truth. The harbor still worked. And in the final section, that truth will widen beyond Pearl Harbor itself, into the broader course of the Pacific War, and into the deeper reason this attack, for all its violence, became one of the most dangerous strategic miscalculations of the Second World War. In the end, Pearl Harbor did not answer Japan with a single moment. It answered with continuity. That is the largest realization in this story, and it is the one least visible on December 7, 1941. When the bombs fell and the battleships burned, it seemed as though the Pacific War had opened with a perfect Japanese success. The photographs encouraged that conclusion. The smoke encouraged it. The stunned silence in the harbor encouraged it. Even the logic of the strike encouraged it. Japan had set out to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet long enough to seize resources, expand south, and fortify a defensive empire before America could recover. For a few hours, perhaps even for a few weeks, that ambition looked terrifyingly plausible. But the attack contained a fatal incompleteness. Japan hit the fleet. It did not kill the system. That is the first and most important reveal of the final section. Because what made Pearl Harbor dangerous was never only the number of ships anchored there on a Sunday morning. It was the fact that the harbor was a living military organism. It had fuel. It had repair yards. It had dry docks. It had machine shops, submarine facilities, skilled workers, command structure, and the ability to transform damage into delayed but usable power. Those things were less dramatic than exploding magazines and burning decks. They did not dominate the headlines, but they determined whether Pearl Harbor would become a graveyard or remain a weapon. It remained a weapon. That is why this story matters so much beyond irony. Nevada, California, and West Virginia rising from the water were not just salvage milestones. They were proof that the attack had failed to impose permanent paralysis. Yorktown's emergency repair in 72 hours was not just a shipyard miracle. It was a strategic signal. It showed that Pearl Harbor could still influence the tempo of war. And when Japanese prisoners from Midway arrived in Hawaii in June and July 1942, they entered a harbor that had already crossed the line from survival to usefulness, not fully rebuilt in every sense, but operationally alive. That distinction changes everything, because if Pearl Harbor is alive, then the American counteroffensive does not begin from the U.S. mainland. It begins much farther forward. It begins from Hawaii, from a base Japan believed it had crippled and which now continues to refuel ships, repair damage, dispatch submarines, process prisoners, and anchor Pacific Command under Chester Nimitz. And once that forward base remains in action, the war shortens in strategic terms, not literally in time perhaps, but in pressure. Japan's hoped-for window of freedom narrows. Its perimeter becomes more vulnerable sooner. Its victories have less time to harden into security. The consequences of Midway become more severe. The approach to Guadalcanal becomes more dangerous. The larger industrial contest, already tilted against Japan, begins moving faster than Japanese planners can comfortably absorb. That is the second reveal. Pearl Harbor was not merely the site of America's humiliation. It became one of the first demonstrations of America's method of victory. Absorb the blow. Preserve the system. Restore function. Return to battle. Expand pressure. That pattern would define far more than Hawaii. It would define the wider Pacific War. Again and again, the United States would show that its greatest strength was not avoiding damage. It was recovering from damage at a scale and speed its enemies could not match. Pearl Harbor was the first great proof of that truth under fire. And so the title of this story points towards something deeper than documented astonishment on a prisoner's face. We do not need to invent a line of disbelief to understand the meaning of what those Japanese POWs encountered. The harbor itself was the statement. The cranes, the dry docks, the harbor traffic, the repair activity, the scars that had not disappeared but had already been put to work again. Those were enough. For men carried into captivity after Midway, Pearl Harbor offered a silent contradiction to the promise of December. This place had been attacked with brilliance. It had not been broken in the way Japan needed. And that may be the hardest lesson in all of modern war. A nation is not defeated when its ships are burning. It is defeated when its capacity to replace, repair, organize, and continue is gone. At Pearl Harbor, America lost ships, men, and illusions. But it did not lose that capacity. So the harbor answered back, not with one speech, though Roosevelt gave the words a nation needed. Not with one admiral, though Nimitz gave the Pacific War its steadiness. Not with one ship, though Yorktown carried the proof to Midway. It answered back with welders, divers, pumps, dry docks, fuel lines, labor shifts, patched hulls, and the refusal of a wounded base to stop functioning. That was the failure hidden inside Japan's greatest tactical triumph. And by the time Japanese prisoners entered Pearl Harbor in the summer of 1942, they were not looking at the ruins of a completed victory. They were looking at the opening evidence that the war Japan had begun there was already turning against it.